It's been 15 days since that night. December 28th. The date etched into my memory like an ember that refuses to cool. My waist still aches, a dull reminder of the chaos and pleasure that intertwined at that swing party. But let me start from the beginning, where the story truly began before the fire ignited. I moved to California 3 months ago, a refugee from the monotony of my London life. The sun-soaked beaches and breezy promises of freedom lured me westward. Unpacking boxes in my new rental, I felt both exhilarated and untethered, a slate wiped clean but devoid of direction. That's when I met David. He appeared like a knight in cargo shorts, offering help with my heaviest boxes. Dark-haired, olive-skinned, and blessed with that kind of effortless charm, David was everything London wasn't. Relaxed, open, free. He introduced himself with a lopsided grin, and by the time we unloaded the last box, he'd invited me over to properly welcome me to the neighborhood. The welcome was everything I hadn't realized I needed. David's home was a modern haven, filled with the scent of cedarwood and leather. That first evening, over a bottle of red wine that felt like liquid courage, we talked for hours. His laugh was contagious, his stories vivid, and his gaze, God, that gaze, lingered a second longer than was polite. By the time I left, my stomach was fluttering, and I was imagining a life together before I even had my furniture fully assembled. The first week passed in a blur of visits. I found excuses to knock on his door, each one less premeditated than the last. From shared dinners to lazy afternoons where we swapped childhood memories, it was like sinking into a warm bath of possibilities. I started believing I'd stumbled into something rare. But life rarely unfolds how you dream it, does it? Then Sarah arrived. She was David's friend, though her abrupt introduction and the way her arm brushed his as she laughed told another story. Sarah was striking, tall, blonde, with eyes like twin glaciers. At first, I felt a chill in her presence. She was polite but distant, the kind of woman who seemed to catalog your flaws while smiling sweetly. I thought, this won't work. She'll be the wall between David and me. Except Sarah came to my house the next day, uninvited but oddly welcome. She brought a bottle of Prosecco, her demeanor transformed. Gone was the aloof frostiness, replaced by an almost disarming warmth. She asked about my work, my family, my dreams, and I found myself drawn in, lulled by her attention. Before I knew it, we were laughing like old friends, the bottle emptied between us. Sarah stayed the night, her slender frame curled on my sofa as we talked into the small hours. The week that followed saw us becoming inseparable. She showed up unannounced with coffee, coaxed me into late-night walks, and lounged around my place with a casualness that felt like she'd always been part of my life. By the third night, she ditched her pajamas altogether, wandering around my apartment in nothing but a tank top and underwear, as if modesty was an afterthought. It felt intoxicating, this sudden intimacy. I didn't question it. Why would I? After years of feeling stifled in London, this was freedom. And yet, a quiet voice in my mind began to whisper, what does she really want? The answer revealed itself one evening when David invited me over for a drink. Us, actually, because Sarah had tagged along without asking. The dynamic was different, charged with an undercurrent I couldn't quite place. They shared knowing glances, their laughter dipping into a register that left me feeling like an outsider. And then came the invitation. David leaned back, his gaze settling on me with a weight I hadn't felt before. We're hosting a little gathering next weekend, he said, his voice smooth as silk. You should come. It's intimate. Sarah chimed in, her smile coy. It's always fun. Very open-minded. The way they said it, the lingering in their words, sent a ripple of something through me. Curiosity, fear, desire. I didn't answer right away, and they didn't push. But when I looked at David, his dark eyes simmering with a challenge, I knew my decision had already been made. I told myself it was just a party, a chance to meet new people, to loosen the knot in my chest that had been coiling since the move. But as I lay awake that night, imagining what intimate might mean in their world, my body buzzed with anticipation. This wasn't London. This wasn't my past life. Here I could become someone else. I was lying in bed, the clock glowing 12:02 a.m. in the darkness, when the shrill sound of my phone broke the silence. My heart jolted. Who calls this late? I grabbed the phone from the nightstand, squinting at the screen. Sarah. I hesitated for a moment before answering, my voice groggy. Hello. Hey, she said, her voice low and warm, almost conspiratorial. Did I wake you? No, I lied, my pulse quickening. Something about Sarah's tone always carried an edge, like she knew more than she let on. Well, good, she said, her words almost playful. Listen, I've been meaning to tell you something. About the party this weekend. My breath hitched, the air in the room suddenly heavier. What about it? She paused, the silence stretching just long enough to make my skin prickle. Then, softly but clearly, she said, it's a swing party. I think you've heard of it before. My stomach flipped, heat spreading from my chest down to my toes. A bead of sweat rolled down my neck, and I shifted under the covers, suddenly aware of how thin the fabric felt against my skin. Swing party. The words echoed in my head, delicious and dangerous. Are you still there? She asked, her voice dipping lower like she already knew my answer. Yes, I croaked, my throat dry. Hey, I've heard of them. She chuckled, the sound warm and knowing. I had a feeling. So what do you think? Are you in? Yes. The word tumbled out of me faster than I intended, but there was no taking it back. My cheeks burned even though she couldn't see me. I'll go. Her laugh was like honey, rich and slow. Oh, I knew you'd say yes. You've got the look of someone who's been curious for a while. We hung up shortly after, but sleep was impossible. My mind was racing, spinning through images I didn't even realize I had tucked away. The thrill, the anticipation, it all felt intoxicating. I wanted this. I needed this. The morning after. When morning came, I was a woman on a mission. I spent hours researching swing parties. What to wear, what to say, how to navigate this unfamiliar terrain. Every article, every forum post, felt like a glimpse into another world, one I had always wondered about but never dared enter. By noon, I felt like I had a strategy, a sense of control that steadied my nerves. With that confidence bolstering me, I walked over to David's house. He opened the door with his usual easy smile. His shirt unbuttoned just enough to reveal the line of his collarbone. Morning, he said, leaning casually against the doorframe. What's up? Swing parties, I blurted, the words hanging in the air between us. His brows lifted in surprise, but his grin widened. Oh, someone's been doing their homework. I stepped inside, brushing past him, and felt the cool air of his living room envelop me. Sarah told me about the party. I wanted to know how these things work. He shut the door behind me, the soft click reverberating in my chest. Well, they're not as complicated as you might think, he said, motioning for me to sit. It's all about comfort, respect, fun. We settled onto the couch, his explanation flowing easily as if he'd done this 100 times before. But it wasn't his words that held my attention. It was the way he leaned closer, the way his eyes seemed to trace the curve of my shoulder as I shifted in my seat. And what about? I hesitated, my voice soft. What about when it's your first time? David's smile softened, his hand resting on the back of the couch. You set your boundaries and you stick to them. And if you feel nervous, just find someone you trust to stay close to. Like you. The words slipped out before I could stop them. His eyes darkened, the corner of his mouth tugging into a smirk. If that's what you want. The air between us crackled, charged with something neither of us said out loud. Before I knew it, I was leaning back into the cushions, my legs tucked under me, and David was closer than he'd been before. My breathing quickened as I realized the straps of my tank top had slipped down, exposing more skin than I'd intended. His gaze flicked to my shoulder, then back to my eyes. Are you nervous? No, I whispered, though my racing heart betrayed me. Good, he said, leaning back, giving me space even though part of me wished he wouldn't. Then you're ready. The rest of that day felt like walking on clouds, though my feet never quite touched the ground. Every glance at the clock sent a shiver through me, time moving both impossibly slow and far too fast. The anticipation had me spinning in a delicious kind of haze, my mind replaying the closeness of David, the promise of the party, and the heat that lingered in the air between us. By evening I was restless. The usual comfort of my apartment felt confining, the silence pressing against my skin like an itch I couldn't scratch. Then, as if on cue, there was a knock at my door. Soft but deliberate. My heart leaped before my feet carried me to answer it. 'Twas Sarah. She stood there, leaning against the doorframe like she owned the world. Her hair was pulled into a loose ponytail, and her tank top clung to her in a way that seemed effortless and deliberate all at once. She was holding a bottle of wine, the corners of her mouth curling into a smirk as she said, "Thought you could use some company." I stepped aside, wordless, and let her in. She moved through my space like she belonged there, setting the bottle on the kitchen counter and pulling glasses from the cabinet without asking. She poured us each a generous helping, handing one to me before settling onto my couch. "You've been thinking about it all day, haven't you?" she asked, her tone teasing but not unkind. I took a sip of wine, hoping it would calm the fluttering in my chest. "I'm curious," I admitted, the words feeling both brave and vulnerable. Her gaze lingered on me, sharp but amused. "Curiosity's a good start. But it's only fun if you let yourself enjoy it. No holding back." Her words were a challenge, but they didn't need to be. I already knew I wasn't planning on holding back. We talked as the evening wore on, the wine loosening our laughter, and the space between us on the couch seemed to shrink with every shared story. At one point, Sarah leaned back, her legs curled under her, and tugged her sweater off, leaving her in just her tank top and shorts. Her confidence was intoxicating, a kind of freedom I hadn't realized I craved. "Have you ever done something like this before?" I asked, my voice hesitant but curious. She tilted her head, her lips quirking into a smile. "Not my first rodeo," she said, her tone light. "But I remember my first time. Nerve-wracking at first, sure, but," her voice trailed off, her smile deepening. "Let's just say it was unforgettable." Her words settled over me like a warm blanket, a mix of reassurance and promise. I leaned back, letting the wine and her presence lull me into a rare kind of ease. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through the curtains and the sound of birds outside the window. Stretching, I became acutely aware of the previous night. The easy laughter, the shared closeness, and how Sarah had lingered longer than I expected, her presence both grounding and electrifying. The thought made me smile as I slipped out of bed and into the shower, letting the warm water wash away the remnants of sleep. By the time I was dressed and ready for the day, I felt lighter, more alive. Stepping outside, I found myself heading to David's place again. I wasn't entirely sure what I planned to say, but the pull was undeniable. When he answered the door, his eyes lit up with a mix of surprise and something warmer. "Morning," he said, stepping aside to let me in. The air in his living room felt as charged as it had the day before, but now there was an undercurrent of expectation. We fell into conversation easily, but as we talked, I noticed how his eyes lingered on me a moment too long, how the space between us seemed to narrow with every shared laugh. At one point, I found myself on the couch beside him, my body angled toward his. The conversation turned to the party again, the details spilling out between us like a secret we were both in on. "You don't have to do anything you're not comfortable with," David said, his voice soft but firm. "But if you want to explore, this is the place for it." The sincerity in his tone disarmed me, but it was the way his hand rested on the back of the couch, close enough that I could feel the heat of him, that made my pulse race. "I think I'll be fine," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. His smile was warm but edged with something playful. "I think you will be too." The closeness was intoxicating, but it wasn't overwhelming. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something that was mine to take should I choose to. The house was buzzing, alive with soft music, laughter, and the hum of voices blending together like an intoxicating melody. Here we were, Sarah, David, and I, stepping into a world that felt equal parts surreal and electrifying. The lighting was low, candles casting flickering shadows on walls adorned with soft drapery, creating an intimate, almost dreamlike atmosphere. My heart raced, my breaths shallow as we entered the living room where 6 men lounged, their gazes sharp and deliberate. I stayed close to Sarah, my anchor in this sea of the unknown. Her confidence radiated, a beacon I clung to as I mirrored her every move. She leaned against the bar with an easy elegance, gesturing for a drink, and I followed suit, mimicking her smile, her posture, her casual laugh. It was an act, but it helped mask the nervous energy coursing through me. The men, each impossibly confident in their own way, seemed to focus their attention on me. Their eyes lingered, not with judgment but with something else, something predatory. At first, it was thrilling, their attention a heady cocktail that made my skin tingle. I felt alive, desirable, like the center of a storm. But as the minutes ticked by, the pace of the evening shifted. What began as playful flirtation grew more intense, more insistent. Half of the men had gravitated toward me, their touches becoming bolder, their proximity suffocating. My initial sense of comfort began to wane, replaced by a strange mix of excitement and unease. I told myself it was fine. I told myself to push through. Everything became a blur. Time felt elastic, minutes stretched into eternity, then snapped back into fleeting moments. My senses dulled, yet the intensity around me amplified. At one point, I felt a sharp pain radiating from deep inside, a discomfort that begged for attention, but I shoved it aside. Pain didn't matter. I was here to feel everything, to lose myself in the moment. Sudden shift. And then it happened. A sharp, searing pain bloomed in my pelvis, so sudden and overwhelming it stole the air from my lungs. My vision blurred, spots dancing before my eyes as I heard David's voice rise above the din, panicked and loud. "Oh my God. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." The world snapped back into focus and I saw it. Ketchup. Splattered on my thighs, staining my skin and the fabric beneath me. The sight made my stomach lurch. I stumbled to my feet, my legs shaky beneath me, and fled to the bathroom, my breath ragged and shallow. Sarah followed me, her face pale and stricken. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. She helped me to the sink, her hand steadying me as I tried to clean the mess, but the more I wiped, the more I realized this wasn't just a surface wound. "Look," I said, my voice breaking. I pointed at the deep red streak that refused to fade. Sarah's expression changed in an instant, her eyes wide with horror. "Your tissue," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's torn." I stared at her, uncomprehending at first, until the weight of her words hit me. My knees buckled, and for a moment, the edges of my vision went dark. She caught me before I hit the floor, her arms wrapping around me as I shook with fear. The hospital. The next hours blurred into a nightmare of bright lights, antiseptic smells, and cold metal instruments. At the hospital, I sobbed uncontrollably, the pain of my body mingling with the shame and regret that clawed at my chest. The doctor's words were a blur, something about stitches, rest, and a healing period of 21 days. They handed me ointments and instructions, but the only thing that stuck in my mind was the overwhelming sense of having made a grave mistake. When I returned home, the house was eerily silent. David and Sarah were gone, the life they'd brought with them extinguished. Sarah called me once in the days that followed, her tone distant, her words empty. I was alone, left to confront the consequences of my choices with no one to lean on. The aftermath. 15 days later, the physical wounds were beginning to heal, but the emotional scars remained fresh, raw, and unrelenting. I replayed the night in my mind over and over, searching for the moment I could have stopped it all. But it always led back to one conclusion. I had ignored my instincts. I had chased an experience without considering the risks. This story isn't easy to tell, but I share it as a warning. Swing parties may seem enticing, alluring, and glamorous, but they come with risks, physical, emotional, and otherwise. Never go into something so vulnerable with people you don't completely trust. No thrill is worth the pain of regret. Thank you for listening and please stay safe.